To shine a light on the fight against censorship and celebrate the freedom to read, we invite local artists and the general public, ages 13 and up, to submit original artwork to QPL's Banned Books Library Card Design Contest. The winning art will be featured on QPL's Banned Books Special Edition Library Card, and the winning artist will also receive a $2,000 cash prize. Learn more and enter the contest today at queenslib.org/design contest. Our Hispanic Heritage Month celebrations continue at the library. Explore our virtual and in-person programs, discover our special Hispanic Heritage book lists for all ages, and grab a copy of our Hispanic Heritage brochure from your local library. Visit queenslib.org/blog to learn more. Halloween is coming soon. It's time to make some spooky crafts, watch scary movies, hear ghost stories, and wear your favorite costume. And you can do all of that and more at the library. Visit the QPL calendar on our website to learn about all of our Halloween programs.
Good evening, and welcome to How to Watch the 2024 Presidential Election Returns. I'm Scott McLeod, the Director of Civic Engagement for Queens Public Library. In 6 days, the country can exercise its civic duty to elect the next President of the United States, as well as a host of other elected offices at the federal, state, and local level, and vote on propositions that enact new laws or amend existing legislation. In many states, early voting is already underway in record numbers, and terms and concepts such as electoral college, popular vote, purple and swing states, election delegates, and certified votes are prevalent within the media. And with so much happening in regards to the political future of the country, Queens Public Library wants to help you have a clearer understanding and knowledge of civic literacy, the roots of American democracy, and how this information helps to shape our society. Tonight, we are privileged to have with us Stephen Schneebaum, a lawyer based in Washington, D.C., and for 35 years, an adjunct professor of international and constitutional law at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Tonight, Stephen will discuss the history of the Electoral College and its impact on politics, along with sharing his thoughts on what information and trends to keep an eye on during election night to help analyze and understand returns. Stephen is a proud Queens native with degrees from Yale and Oxford universities. He is also a Queens Public Library Foundation board member and credits the library for having nurtured his lifelong love of reading starting at a very young age. Before I turn the floor over to Stephen, I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight on YouTube and Facebook, and want you to know that we are conducting a question and answer period following the presentation. Now, I encourage everyone to submit your questions for Stephen throughout the evening. Do not wait until the end. We want you to use the respective chat boxes on Facebook and YouTube so they can be answered. Now, without further ado, and with that said, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, and good evening, everyone. As a Queens Public Library patron from childhood, I am truly honored to be able to talk with you about this subject today. My goal is to make a small contribution to the library's wonderful work, providing civic education to all of the diverse people and communities of this borough. So I am delighted to welcome you, Queens residents and others, who want to learn more about the enormously important decision of American voters that will be revealed next week. The right to vote is a human right. It is protected by our Constitution and by international instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We are all aware that there are many countries around the world that pay lip service to the idea that the people should choose their leaders freely and without fear of retaliation. But the right to vote means nothing if we don't feel an obligation to participate in the democratic process. So if you're a United States citizen and you are eligible to vote in this election, please be certain to do so. So let's begin. How does the system work? As I'm certain you all know, the President of the United States is not elected by the popular vote. The voting that counts in this election will take place in state capitals across the country in December. But next Tuesday, we, the people, will select the members of the Electoral College who will cast those critical votes. The Electoral College has no classes and no football team. It has no professors and no students. It has one function and one function only. Every 4 years, its members meet and cast their ballots for the president and the vice president according to a process laid out in the Constitution and grounded in our history. This is, of course, a bit odd by international standards. In most countries that have genuine elections at all, the candidate who gets the most votes wins, and the ones who do not lose. But that is not the way our Constitution is set up. Our founders feared that if the people at large had the power to select the country's leader, they would be too easily swayed. They would not think carefully enough about what is best for the nation. They would vote in their self-interest, or more probably, in what they thought that their self-interest was. In the hope that the citizens of the country could be protected from themselves, the founders instead created a system by which a limited universe of voters, white men exclusively, and in many states, white men who were landowners, would choose wise, publicly spirited electors who would, in turn, select the best person for the job. That person would not have to be what we today call a politician. No one would run for the office of president. The Electoral College would meet, debate, and unerringly select the right man from among the best and the brightest in the nation. And that system worked a few times. George Washington did not actively seek the presidency, yet the Electoral College designated him twice and unanimously as the best person to lead the country. But what the founders pictured did not last, because something happened very quickly that they failed to foresee. Almost immediately after the Constitution was ratified by the original 13 states, the American political space split into two major political parties, which took very different positions on the issues of the day. Candidates from those parties announced their desire to be chosen as president by the electors, who, in turn, promised in advance to support them. Although the Electoral College system was not designed with this in mind, it has not been restructured in a major way since 1787. So while voters in each state still choose electors and not candidates today, the electors are really only stand-ins. They're intermediaries, tasked with carrying out the will of their state's voters. We generally do not even know their names, which do not appear on the ballot. We vote for electors who have pledged to support the candidate of our choice. That is in the Constitution. Also there is the method for assigning electoral votes to the various states. The number of electors to which each state is entitled is the number of seats it has in the two houses of Congress combined, which is to say, its delegation in the House of Representatives, which is determined by population, plus 2, since each state has 2 senators. And 3 votes are given to the District of Columbia, where I live and vote, although the district has no members of Congress. Currently, there are 435 members of Congress and 100 senators. So 538 Electoral College votes are at stake next Tuesday. 435 plus 100 plus 3 for DC. The majority required to win, therefore, is 270. The candidate who gets 270 electoral votes will become president, regardless of how many votes he or she receives from the total population. Now, because electoral votes are assigned by the Constitution to the states, 48 of the 50 states treat the selection of electors as a statewide election. In those states, the set of electors pledged to the candidate who gets the most votes, regardless of how small the margin, will be elected. Despite what most people and even many reporters seem to think, this arrangement is not in the Constitution. It is open to the states to select their electors in any way they choose. They could apportion them according to the popular vote, although no state currently does. They could allocate some of the electoral votes by congressional district, as 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, actually do. But over the centuries, little creativity has been dedicated to trying to improve the degree to which the Electoral College actually reflects the will of the people. So think of it this way. In New York, 28 individuals pledged to vote for Vice President Harris are running as a bloc and not as individuals against the same number of people who have promised to cast New York's Electoral College votes for former President Trump. Whichever candidate's set of electors gets even one more vote than the other will cast all of New York State's electoral college votes for that candidate. So there is no guarantee that the person whom most Americans want to have as their president will actually win that office. Even as restrictions on who may vote have eased over the last 2 centuries, and a far larger portion of the population has won that right, 5 times in our history, and twice in the last quarter century, the man who was elected president did not win the most votes. John Quincy Adams in 1824, Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, George W. Bush in 2000, and of course, Donald Trump in 2016. And it's worth noting that since 1990, that is, over the last 8 election cycles, only once has the Republican candidate for the presidency actually won the popular vote. That was George W. Bush in 2004, even though 3 times a Republican was elected to office. It may seem strange that in 2016, a candidate who received millions more votes than her opponent did not become the president. But what is even stranger is this. In 2016, Donald Trump got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton, and yet he won 304 votes in the Electoral College and therefore the presidency. In 2020, Joe Biden received nearly 7 million more popular votes than Donald Trump, and Biden won the presidency with 306 electoral votes, almost exactly the same margin. The winner-take-all system is a quirk of our presidential electoral process that was not baked in from the beginning. It is a tradition, not a requirement. Yet it has led to very important consequences for the candidates and for our citizens. First, it means that there is no real electoral contest in many states because they are predictably Democratic or Republican, and therefore they can be taken for granted. For example, 3 of the 10 biggest states, California, New York, and Illinois, are solidly blue, which is to say, Democratic. Together, those 3 states represent over 20% of the population of the country and contain 3 of our 4 largest cities. 3 others of the biggest states are reliably red or Republican: Texas, Florida, and Ohio. In those states, neither party's presidential candidate needs to compete seriously, and this year, neither of them did. A national campaign is typically concentrated, and this year is no exception, exclusively in the so-called swing or purple states. That is, those that are neither blue nor red, but where the election will be close and where it is hard to be confident of the outcome. In each of those states, just a small number of ballots will probably separate the winner from the loser. But those small margins are enormously important because the winner of each state will get all of its electoral votes. This year, there appear to be 7 swing states: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. In total, they have 93 electoral votes, about 1/6 of the total, and every one of these is a winner-take-all state. The focus of the election campaign in those states, and only those states, produces extreme oddities. For example, South Carolina is predictably a Republican state. No Democratic candidate for the presidency has carried South Carolina since Jimmy Carter in 1976. Its neighbor, North Carolina, however, is a swing state. Barack Obama won it in 2008, and President Biden lost to Trump in 2022 by just over a single percentage point. Charlotte, North Carolina, and Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, are about 90 miles apart. Yet citizens in Charlotte have been very much in demand, while those who live on the other side of the state line have safely been ignored. No one bothers to ask for their votes. No one comes before them to debate the issues. No one treats them as if they matter. And while occasionally there may be surprises in states that are not considered purple, the notion that well over half of the American public can be safely disregarded by both campaigns hardly suggests that all citizens' votes are treated equally. But this is not the only and may not be the most serious quirk in the system, which has led to a process very different from the one that the founders intended to leave to us. The way in which Electoral College votes are assigned to states is grounded in history, and in particular, it is grounded in the history of slavery in the United States. And here is why I say that. The drafters of our Constitution in 1787 needed to balance the interests of the 13 very different original states, which were far from united in their desire for a strong central government. To do so, they reached 2 compromises, which may have been completely sensible at the time, but the reasons for which are certainly no longer relevant to the modern day. First, the so-called Connecticut Compromise established a Congress with 2 chambers. In the House of Representatives, members are allocated to the states in proportion to their population. However, each state has the same number of senators. This was intended to provide the smaller states, whose economies were not primarily agricultural, and therefore most of which did not depend upon enslaved people for their livelihoods, with assurances that their interests would not be overridden by the larger states. The big states were Virginia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, each with over 10% of the population of the country. The small states were Delaware, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Georgia. None of these had more than 3.5% of the total. So the ratio of the populations of the smallest, Delaware, to the biggest, Virginia, was about 1 to 12. So it was understood and accepted that senators representing Delaware had the same power as senators from Virginia, although the Virginia senators represented 12 times as many people. But in assigning members of the House, there was another problem. Large numbers of the people who resided, for example, in Virginia and North Carolina, among the most populous states, were considered by law to be not humans, but beasts of burden, owned by wealthy planters. Enslaved persons made up nearly 40% of the population of Virginia and over 25% in North Carolina. What to do about them? Obviously, if enslaved individuals counted fully as part of the population, the southern states would have more seats in the House of Representatives and therefore more electors than they would have if they were not counted. But the northern non-slave states pointed out the hypocrisy of this. People in bondage were treated as property, and by law, that is exactly what they were. So why should they be counted in allocating congressional seats? This dispute resulted in the second of the compromises, without which the Constitution would never have been adopted. For purposes of the census, that is, for purposes of counting the population, each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a free person. This compromise, which is enshrined in the Constitution itself, is frequently misunderstood. It was not their owners who argued that enslaved people should not be taken into account at all. It was those who opposed the institution of slavery. And the idea that people of African descent, brought to these shores under horrific conditions and forced to live out their lives denied the most basic elements of human dignity, should be counted even as 3/5 of free citizens, resulted in benefits not to them, but to those who supported the continuation of slavery until a bloody war brought it to an end nearly 75 years later. In the first Congress, the allocation of House seats, applying the compromise, was 10 for Virginia, 8 for Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and 5 for North Carolina. Georgia and New Hampshire had 3 each. Delaware and Rhode Island each had 1. Thus, when the Electoral College met in 1792 to re-elect George Washington, it had 95 members, 67 reflecting the House membership, and 28 the Senate. By that time, Vermont had been admitted as the 14th state. Virginia had 12 electors, but Massachusetts and Pennsylvania each had 10. Yet the free populations of those states were about the same. The effect of this was to bake into the system the disproportionate influence of the slave states. And as a result, 10 winners of the first 12 presidential elections, 5 of our first 7 presidents, not only came from slave states, but were themselves slaveholders. Slavery, of course, was abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865, just after the Civil War ended. But the impact of the original system of allocating congressional seats and therefore electoral votes is far larger today. The population distributions among the states now are hugely different from what they were in 1792. The ratio of the smallest state today, Wyoming, to the biggest, California, is no longer 1 to 12. It is now 1 to 67. But because of the way Electoral College seats are assigned, the 39 million citizens of California have 54 electoral votes, while the 585,000 people of Wyoming have 3. I'm going to do some arithmetic, which I hope will show you just how significant this is. Stay with me. Each California elector represents 722,000 people, while each Wyoming elector represents 195,000. That means that in the Electoral College, Wyoming is overrepresented by a factor of 3.75, that is 722 rather, divided by 193. If membership in the Electoral College were to represent states in real proportion to their populations, and if we take Wyoming's 3 as the standard, California should have not 54 electoral votes, but 201. And if we take California's 54 votes as the benchmark, for any state to merit 3 electoral votes, it should have to have a minimum of 3 times 722,000, or 2.17 million residents. But 15 states and the District of Columbia have populations smaller than that. And each of them has 3, and some have 4, electoral votes. All of them, therefore, are overrepresented in the Electoral College. And the thing that these smaller states have in common, with just a few exceptions, is no longer, as it was in the 18th century, the driver of their economies, but the fact that most of their citizens do not live in cities. Today, as a result, the Electoral College locks in a very strong bias in favor of rural states, even though 80% of the American population today lives in or near cities. The 28 states with no city of over 500,000 inhabitants have more power than they should have in a one-person, one-vote environment, and the 23 jurisdictions with 1 or more large cities have less. And the fact is that rural states are more reliably Republican, and urban ones more likely to vote Democratic. Here's the evidence. 16 jurisdictions are home to the 25 largest cities in America. Of those 16 in 2020, 10 were carried by Biden and 6 by Trump. But of the 35 states with no big cities, Trump carried 24 and Biden 11. Now, there's an interesting side note to this. As I've shown, the Electoral College vote distribution seems to favor Republican voters and disfavor Democratic ones, but that isn't quite correct. According to most of the polls, this year, before the swing states are accounted for, the starting positions, that is, the Electoral College predictions not including the swing states, have Vice President Harris starting out at 226 electoral votes and Mr. Trump with 219. Either candidate to win needs to do well in those 7 swing states. This shows again their critical importance. They will determine who will be the next president of the United States. So the Electoral College system, at least as applied today, is not consistent with the requirement of universal and equal suffrage for 2 reasons. It ignores American citizens in the states whose outcomes are predictable, and it builds in a structural bias against voters who live in cities. There are, of course, defenders of the Electoral College even today. They point out, correctly, that if California's voters had an equal say in deciding who would be the next president as those in, for example, a swing state like North Carolina, then a lot of resources would have to be invested by candidates to harvest a comparatively small number of votes. But I think that argument fails as a matter of fact and as a matter of logic. Perhaps if Donald Trump had a reason to campaign in California, he would be able to persuade many more voters there to support him rather than to stay home, because their votes would matter. And he might even use them to forge a nationwide popular majority. Perhaps if Kamala Harris had campaigned in South Carolina, although she has no hope of carrying the state, and therefore her supporters little incentive to show up next Tuesday, the overwhelming majority she will likely win in the cities of Charleston and Columbia by providing a substantial contribution to her national popular vote would add to her prospects of winning across the country. The other argument sometimes heard in defense of the current system is that it would be unfair to allow cities to have greater weight than less populous areas. There is no doubt that citizens dependent on agriculture have different needs from those who take the subway to work. But the response to this is simple. In a democracy, more people are supposed to have a bigger say in election outcomes. The 8 million people of New York City have and should have greater weight in the election of the governor of New York State than the residents of a small town near Niagara Falls. But if we think of ourselves simply as equal citizens, which is what the one person, one vote principle requires, then it should not matter where we live. If the voters of a largely urban state elect officials who campaign on their understanding of urban issues, well, that is because they are appealing to the interests of the majority of the people. No other conclusion is compatible with democracy. All of that said, however, fundamentally changing the Electoral College system would require a constitutional amendment, as would addressing the underlying cause of the problem, which is giving all states the same number of Senate seats. The Constitution, however, is extremely difficult to alter. There have been only 27 amendments in over 230 years. Not only does an amendment require 2/3 approval from both houses of Congress, but it must also be ratified separately by 3/4 of the states. Given that overrepresented states would certainly never agree to reducing their influence over presidential elections, it is impossible to foresee that such a change will ever come. And the Constitution expressly says that the equal representation of the states in the Senate is the only provision that cannot ever be altered by amendment. So that option is forever off the table. Some viewers may have heard about a very clever idea that has been proposed to address some of these problems. The so-called interstate compact would allow states to agree that they will assign all of their electoral votes not to the candidate who wins in that state, but to the winner of the national popular vote. I say that this is clever because it would avoid the need for a constitutional amendment. There are some legal hurdles that would need to be overcome, but I think, and many think, that is doable. But here's the problem. The compact would come into effect when and if it is agreed by the legislatures of states constituting a majority of the Electoral College. As of today, it has been adopted by 17 states and the District of Columbia with 209 electoral votes, only 77% of the 270 needed to give the compact legal force. And of course, the opposition comes from the very states that are now enjoying more weight than they deserve in presidential elections. So that is not likely to change. Nor is this the only way in which the US fails to implement the requirements of one person, one vote in our selection of a head of state. The lack of a uniform system of registering voters, conducting the elections, and counting ballots also serves to dilute and to distort the expression of voters' wills. The complications and uncertainties coming from the hodgepodge of governing regimes have been very apparent in 2024. And for this reason, it is quite likely that we will not know on Tuesday evening who will be our next president. The states decide who may vote by controlling the process of registration. They get to select the means, the places, the procedures, and the technologies for casting and for counting votes. Many states further assign those powers to counties and cities, making the inconsistencies even worse. In 2000, for example, one of the reasons the Supreme Court gave for installing George W. Bush in the White House was that votes cast in different areas of Florida were being counted under different rules. The court concluded that Florida voters were therefore not receiving the equal protection of the laws in violation of the Constitution. But what the court did not say, and yet what is perfectly obvious, is that such inequality will always be seen where there is no central control over how elections are conducted. This lack of uniformity is a procedural nightmare, of course. We will see this clearly on Tuesday night, when television hosts will need to explain in detail the different systems for counting ballots in different parts of the country. For example, large numbers of people, maybe many of you watching, cast paper ballots often weeks before Election Day. But under some state laws, those votes cannot be counted until Tuesday night when the polls are closed. Because the tabulation of those paper ballots will be delayed, there will be, as there was in 2020, suspicion of fraud or conspiracy when apparent majorities in favor of one candidate or the other seem to disappear and the lead seems to shift on election night and over the days following. Inconsistent enforcement of highly detailed rules, such as the requirement in some states that voters sign the envelopes containing their mail-in ballots with those signatures matched up against signatures on file, were presented as proof of a grand scheme, with a large number of Americans continuing to this day to believe that the election of President Biden was illegitimate. Of course, all available evidence in 2020 demonstrated that these rumors were nonsense. Not one of the many lawsuits challenging the vote counts was successful in changing them. One lawsuit after another was rejected by state and federal courts, yet conspiracy theories continued and continue to spread on social media. That is certain to happen again this year. And with the pollsters' predictions of a very close election, there will be more false rumors, more suspicion, and more involvement of the courts. And the uncertainties will not end there. Congress has done some major work to overhaul the Electoral Count Act, the 1887 statute that made it possible on January 6, 2021, for many senators and representatives to vote not to certify the results of the Electoral College votes. But whether those fixes will be sufficient to avoid a repetition of that dreadful day remains to be seen. By law, state governors will verify the outcomes of voting in their states and submit the numbers to Vice President Harris. As President of the Senate, she is assigned by the Constitution the responsibility to open the sealed Electoral College ballots and to announce the result on January 6th, 2025. Her role on that day will be purely ceremonial. Yet, of course, that did not stop the rioters 4 years ago from demanding that then Vice President Mike Pence be hanged because he refused to overturn the outcome of the election. So anyone who is claiming confidence in predicting the outcome of the presidential election on November 5th, 2024, much less the results of court challenges and electoral college shenanigans, is dreaming. There will be surprises and there will be drama next Tuesday evening. But it will be very surprising if when we all go to bed that night or the next morning, we will know the name of our next president. Now, let me turn now to the second part of my talk. Although we will quite likely not know next Tuesday evening who will take the oath of office on January 20th, some drama will play out with much greater clarity. On the 5th of November, Americans will vote not just for candidates for the presidency, but also for prospective state governors, senators, city mayors, county executives, state and local legislators, judges, court clerks, sheriffs, recorders, counselors, and countless other positions created under the interlocking sets of laws by which our political space is organized. At present, our national legislature is divided. Democrats control the Senate by the very slim margin of 51 to 49, and Republicans have a 4-vote majority in the House. In 2024, 33 Senate seats are being contested, and given that House members serve 2-year terms, every single seat in the lower house is open. A very small shift in votes from 2022 could change the balance of power in either or even in both houses. The conventional wisdom is that the Democrats, with far more seats up for election this year than the Republicans have, will likely lose their Senate edge, while the Democratic Party is very optimistic that it will be able to gain control of the lower house. Ticket splitting, that is, voting for candidates from different parties for different offices, is a common phenomenon in America, and it may be even more significant this year. And given the role of the Senate in confirming cabinet appointments and judges, a Republican Senate may make life very difficult for a Democratic president should Harris be elected. Yet, barring an upset, it looks very difficult as of today to predict that the Democrats will hold the Senate beginning in January. On the other hand, although most observers predicted that the Republican Party would gain large numbers of seats in the House in 2022, that didn't happen. And some of the Republicans who were elected in usually Democratic districts, including several in the blue states of New York and California, appear to be vulnerable. So both houses may change hands in opposite directions. This double flip, if it happens, will be the first in American history. So how should you watch the returns on election night? I'm assuming that some viewers and listeners have never been present in the United States to watch this ritual in prior years. So before I get into specifics, let me offer two general pieces of advice. First, results are reported as they are compiled by election officials. In some states, cities report before rural areas, and in some it's the opposite. So do not jump to conclusions based on partial returns. And even when a large percentage of a state's votes have been counted, the number, location, and type of the uncounted votes may still change the outcome, especially if it's close. Also remember that some American states span 2 time zones, and so when polls close in the eastern part, they may still be open in the west, where it is an hour earlier. So early returns are not to be taken as indicative of final outcomes. Second piece of advice. The networks have developed very sophisticated technology and very knowledgeable reporters who will be presenting what you see on television during election night. When they call a state for one presidential candidate or the other, you may be quite confident that the result in that state is not in doubt. The same is true for Senate and House races. Do not be surprised if many states are called at the very moment their polls close. In those states, exit interviews, results sampling, and other statistical techniques provide assurance of what the outcome will be. So that said, I'm now going to work my way through the evening, showing when various states will begin to report results and pointing to the ones that you should watch carefully. Don't worry if it's hard to keep up. There will be a table at the end of my talk summarizing at least the swing states and the key races. So here we go. Indiana and Kentucky will be the first 2 states to close their polls at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Although both have a small portion of their populations in the Central Time Zone, the results from the Eastern segments will probably allow the networks to call those 2 states for former President Trump. At 7 p.m., the polls will close in South Carolina, which is nearly certain to support Trump, and Vermont, whose 3 electoral votes will be for Harris. But this will mark the beginning of the interesting part of the evening, because also closing at 7, in addition to the western parts of Indiana and Kentucky, will be the eastern portion of Florida and Virginia and Georgia. Virginia is expected to be a blue state this year, but the margin by which Harris wins Virginia compared to Biden's margin in 2020 may indicate a national trend. And Georgia is a critical swing state. For many reasons, including ongoing legal battles, it is nearly certain that final results from Georgia will not be available Tuesday evening, but trends in Georgians voting may be visible. For example, it is anticipated that Black voters in the big cities, Atlanta, Augusta, Savannah, Columbus, Athens, will turn out strongly in support of the vice president. But will they? Some polls have shown a lack of enthusiasm for her, especially among Black men. Is this being reflected in the early returns? At 7:30, Ohio, West Virginia, and North Carolina will close. West Virginia is one of the most reliably red states in the country. Trump will win the presidential vote, and the Republican Senate candidate, a former governor, will almost certainly be elected to the seat currently held by Senator Joe Manchin, who is affiliated with the Democrats. If no other Senate seat flips, this will be enough to create a 50-50 tie in that body. Ohio also has a Senate election, and it is predicted to be close. If the incumbent, Sherrod Brown, has trouble being reelected, this will be a good night for the Republicans. But although Ohio is expected to support Trump in the presidential race, if that vote is close, the Democrats will be smiling. The real attention early on Tuesday evening, though, will be paid to North Carolina. The polls are showing Trump with a slight lead, but Democrats have been hopeful that they can turn the state blue or at least purple. North Carolina will also be electing a governor. The Republican candidate is generally perceived as extremely right-wing. He once referred to himself as a black Nazi. Will the unwillingness of moderate Republican voters to support him generate additional votes for Harris at the top of the ticket? If Harris were to win North Carolina, Trump would have to carry at least one of the large swing states in order to have a hope of being elected. So North Carolina will be pivotal. At 8 o'clock, 22 jurisdictions representing 171 electoral votes, almost a third of the total, will close their polls. Most of them are predictable. Alabama, Florida, Kansas, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas are expected to go for Trump, and Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. will support Harris. But also closing at 8 o'clock are most of Michigan and all of Pennsylvania, both key swing states, and both with Senate elections as well. And although Texas and Florida are reliably Republican at the presidential level, both have Senate races in which Republican incumbents, Rick Scott in Florida and Ted Cruz in Texas, have reason to be concerned. If either of those Republican Senate seats changes hands, the Democrats will have a chance of holding the upper house, a very surprising outcome, but one that is not impossible. Many mainstream media have been saying for weeks that the presidential election may come down to Pennsylvania. And indeed, it is difficult to imagine either candidate being elected without carrying Pennsylvania. So we can expect a great deal of attention to be focused by the networks as results come in from the Keystone State. The red state of Arkansas closes at 8:30 Eastern, but at 9 o'clock there will again be a huge wave. Polls will close in 15 states at 9 o'clock. Iowa, Kansas, Louisiana, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, the remainder of Texas and Wyoming will deliver their electoral votes to the former president, while Colorado, Minnesota, and New Mexico should be safe for Vice President Harris. But also closing are Arizona, Wisconsin, and the rest of Michigan. Not long ago, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were thought of as the blue wall, states that would reliably deliver for Democrats. In 2016, Donald Trump won all three, although by very small margins. Joe Biden won all of them back in 2020. This year, analysts report that all of them are too close to predict. If one or more goes for Trump, he will probably be returned to the White House. Harris, by contrast, probably needs to win all three. Now, it may be worth saying a word about the state of Nebraska. The prairie state is deep red. Trump won it by 25 points in 2016 and 19 points in 2020. But there are two interesting things to be aware of there. First, Nebraska is one of the two states that award electoral votes by congressional district, and Harris is expecting to win the district that includes Omaha, the largest city. The other bit of news is that although the state is so red that the Democrats did not nominate an opponent for Republican Senator Deb Fischer, but an independent candidate named Dan Osborne has attracted considerable attention and seems to be giving the incumbent a run for her money. Although he is not a Democrat, Osborne has provided a lot of hope to Democratic strategists that the switch to a Republican Senate is not a foregone conclusion. Arizona, the other swing state, will, I think, be the hardest of all seven for Harris to win. The Democratic Senate candidate, Ruben Gallego, seems to be doing well in the polls, but Trump appears to be leading there. It will be close either way. It is certainly a state to watch. At 10 o'clock, the Republican states of Idaho, Montana, and Utah, and most of the Democratic state of Oregon will close, and so too will the last swing state, Nevada. Democratic presidential candidates have carried Nevada every year since 2004, but the population has changed a lot. And while on a good night for the Democrats, they would not be concerned about that state, neither party is taking Nevada for granted. California's 54 electoral votes will be claimed by Harris, along with Washington's 12 votes shortly after the polls close there at 11 p.m. Eastern. Hawaii will close at midnight and will go for the Democrats, and Alaska at 1 a.m. will be claimed by the Republican candidate. So to sum up, the presidential election will be decided by 7 of the 50 states. If the other 44 jurisdictions, including DC, go as expected, former President Trump is assured of 219 electoral votes, and Vice President Harris of 226 votes. The magic number is 270. So here is something very intriguing. The 3 states that were considered once the blue wall that I mentioned a moment ago, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, together have precisely 44 electoral votes, the exact number that Harris would need to win the presidency by the closest margin since 1876. 2 electoral votes. In other words, if she carries the blue wall, she can lose every other swing state and still become the next president. In the Senate, as I mentioned, it is largely anticipated that Democrats will lose their seats in West Virginia and also in Montana. If nothing else changes, that would give the Republicans a 51-49 edge in the next Senate. And might there be Republican upsets in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania? All have Senate races, increasing their majority? Or could there be a surprise in Texas, Florida, or Nebraska, allowing the Democrats to hold on to control? Now, I can't end a talk about election night without saying something about what might happen in the days and weeks following the announcement of the results. And here It is hard to be as even-handed as I have tried to be so far, so I won't even try. You cannot believe in democracy if you do not understand that your side may lose an election, and that if it does lose, you must accept the loss and move on. You don't have to like it, but you do have to do it. Encouraged by one of the candidates, a large number of Americans have already announced that if Kamala Harris is elected the 47th President of the United States, they will do anything and everything to refuse to recognize that result. That is frightening. It is one thing to use legitimate legal methods to challenge alleged irregularities in voting or counting. That is what the courts are for. It is quite another to threaten or to use violence to prevent the will of the people from being honored. I think it is not a stretch to say that if the aftermath of this election is marked by violence like the last one, if not worse, the United States will have abdicated its century-old role as the world's model of constitutional governance, free and open elections, and the peaceful transition of power. If we believe in this country, if we love this country, if we think this country is capable of continuing to achieve great things, we cannot let this happen, and we cannot tolerate it if it does. That resolve should be shared by every citizen, regardless of her or his political views. It is shocking that these words have to be said in 2024. And it is even more shocking that they have to be said because one man running for the office of the president will not say them. Last time, the guardrails held, barely. Heaven help us if they do not hold this year. My friends, all of this is history in the making, and we will all be witnesses to it. Tuesday evening will be exciting, even riveting. And the stakes, of course, are enormous for the United States and for the world. If you are entitled to vote, please vote. But everyone, everywhere, may participate as observers of the democratic process that has defined our country for nearly a quarter of a millennium. I thank you for listening to me, and I thank the organizers at our beloved Queens Public Library for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. I'll now attempt to answer your questions, but before I do that, I've asked the QPL team to post a chart showing what I think are the states and the races to watch carefully on Tuesday evening. If you're interested, copy it or take a screenshot. And since this talk will be available on YouTube and Facebook, you can always come back to it later. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. And thanks to the Queens Public Library for its commitment to civic education.
This was illuminating. I have notes, and we have several questions for you tonight. So I'm going to actually just get started. I have a couple of questions here from my own sort of a list here. So let me see if I can recap a little bit some of the stuff, the things that kind of jumped out at me. And please correct me if I'm wrong. So the blue wall, those three states that you mentioned. So in terms of key indicators to watch, so the blue wall seems to be the key indicator for Democrats to watch for the evening. If those three states hold, then, you know, running the tables can be a little bit different. On the flip side of this, winning one of the larger swing states is a key indicator for Republicans to watch. Again, same kind of situation. It sort of changes the dynamic. I wanted to make sure that I heard that correctly. Is that the case?
Yes, you absolutely did. If Kamala Harris starts out with the 226 electoral votes that we think she will start out with, and she carries the three states in the blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, then she will be our next president. If she loses one of them, then she has to make up those votes somewhere else. Now, one of the swing states is Nevada. Um, no Republican has won Nevada in a long time. I think 2004 was the most recent. I may be wrong about that, but not for years. If she wins Nevada, she's got a little bit of wiggle room, but not enough. Nevada doesn't provide the votes that Pennsylvania does, and Nevada has 6, Pennsylvania has 19. So if she loses Pennsylvania, she needs Nevada and North Carolina, and or Georgia. Those are going to be tough.
Or Georgia's going to be tough. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to start kind of at the second part of your talk, and then we'll kind of go back to the historical piece. So in a race where all votes should be included, you talked about, the different types of votes and even kind of how each state and municipality decides on, how they're counted, how they're cast, and all of these things. So we've got early voting, we've got absentee voting, we've got mail-in voting, we've got election day voting ballots. How long should people expect the counting of all of these votes to potentially take?
Well, if we wanted to get the complete total popular vote, we probably won't have that until the weekend at the earliest. And I say that because there are some states that have specific legislation that says that if a vote is postmarked on or before Election Day, it can be counted even if it arrives within several days later. We all know that our beloved United States Postal Service doesn't always deliver the mail the day after it's posted. So those in states that have that rule, legitimate countable votes may be arriving as late as Friday and Saturday, and they have to be counted. Votes from service members posted overseas have to be counted when they arrive, as long as they're posted before Election Day, and so on. So if we're interested in knowing the total national outcome, it's going to be a while. In terms, however, of knowing who wins the Electoral College, which is what we care about, it comes down to this. If the swing states are so close that they can't be called by the networks, by the wire services, then we won't know who the president is until they are called. And remember, it's only 4 years ago when Biden's victory was not apparent on election night. It didn't become clear until 2 days later when I think it was Pennsylvania, I may be wrong, was the last, so to speak, domino to fall. So it's impossible to answer that question because it doesn't depend on mechanics. It depends on how close the states actually are.
But we should be able to understand, and I think for all of us and for viewers, it really is. This is not going to be, an election night calling the winner kind of race. This is going to take at least 2 days, 3 days for us to have a reasonable expectation of a winner. And this is using the Electoral College, but with so many races and states being so close, it may come down to needing to do those extra counts on, the mail-in and the absentee, as you mentioned, the service members. So, I want to make sure that everyone watching understands, don't look for, the winner on the 5th of November. You should measure and your expectations to go a few days in this process, and don't get deterred by speculation.
That's absolutely right. And of course, we could all be wrong, right? Predictions have a nasty habit of not coming true, and so it is conceivable that one or the other candidate will have a clear victory in all of the swing states. Maybe there'll be an upset in some state not considered to be a swing state, like Virginia or New Mexico, which are both counted as blue. Both the Democrats expect to win both, but they've been close before and they might be close again. Colorado. So if there could be a blowout, we just don't know. And we do know that in 2016, the very sophisticated knowledgeable statisticians that I was talking about a few minutes ago got it completely wrong. Nobody predicted that Donald Trump would be elected in 2016. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. Some people did. Very clever people did. But the statisticians didn't. The statisticians all assumed that Hillary Clinton would win the blue wall. And that would make it virtually impossible for Trump to break through. She lost all 3 states. And interestingly, remember I said one of the quirks, one of the consequences of this idea that only the swing states count is that if the campaigns don't consider a state to be a swing state, they're not going to pay attention to it. Hillary Clinton never set foot in the state of Wisconsin during the run-up to the 2016 election. She didn't think it was a swing state. Nobody did. She thought it was a blue wall state. Easy win. Well, she lost.
Right.
That
So
could happen.
It could happen. You mentioned the double flip within Congress, so the House and the Senate. And should people look at the results of state Senate or House results as a reliable indicator about the presidential race?
Absolutely not.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
You mentioned sort of, it could be voting for one side of, you could vote for different sides of the ticket based on things. So that should not be counted as a reliable indicator.
No, that's right. Now, again, if there were a huge trend, if say in North Carolina, where the gubernatorial race, as I mentioned, is expected to be fairly lopsided with the Democratic incumbent with the Democratic candidate winning, that may result in some upward reverse coattails, if you like, with the gubernatorial ticket, gubernatorial candidate actually pulling more votes toward Kamala Harris. That could happen. But unless there's a very sharp trend, which would indicate that voters are abandoning one party or the other in large numbers, the Senate races do not predict the presidential outcomes and vice versa. The state of Montana, for example, is as red as they come. It has a Democratic senator, John Tester. He seems to be in some trouble in the polls. He's expected to lose, but the professional predictors are not putting, licking the seal on that one and closing it up. They are saying that it looks as if the state is leaning toward his opponent, but it's not a sure thing. But the outcome of the presidential race in Montana is absolutely a sure thing. Donald Trump will carry the state of Montana. You can put money on it. Not legal. Don't do it. But it could.
So let's shift a little bit to the Electoral College, sort of the historical perspective. We have a couple of questions, 1 or 2 questions for here. So again, let me start off to make sure that I heard things and interpreting things correctly. So you had mentioned how the purpose of the Electoral College was initially intended to promote debate, to choose a leader. It doesn't always have to be a politician. But that didn't really last long due to the emergence of what eventually became the 2-party system. And then with the choices of who would be the president really kind of falling along party lines. I'll put them in quotes, air quotes, party lines. So you talked about how sort of in recent years there have been talks about eliminating the Electoral College, but I think you sort of shared how difficult that process would actually be. I'll ask a question around sort of keeping the Electoral College. Not that we seem to have a choice one way or the other about it, but do you think that there's any significant value in if we could eliminate the Electoral College, what would be sort of the flip side of the argument that we should keep it? Or is there anything that we would, fundamentally lose if we shifted to the popular vote? And you talked a little bit about sort of the downfalls of the popular vote.
Yep. Well, one thing we would lose, of course, is the traditional way of running presidential elections, which has been done, this way for 200 years. with the focus on individual states where each candidate thinks he or she has a chance of winning. That's where you put your energy. There's no point in investing any energy in a state you know you're going to lose. Doesn't make sense. And if you know you're going to win the state, it doesn't make sense to put any effort into that either, especially given that today campaigning is a matter of money. It costs a lot of money to run a campaign. You've got to have television time. You've got to rent venues for rallies. You've got to have materials to hand out. You've got to have red baseball caps or T-shirts or whatever it is that you have. So it's an expensive proposition. Why would you spend that money in a state you know you're going to win or you know you're going to lose when you could spend it in a state where it might make a difference? So I think the main thing that would be lost is our traditional way of doing things. Well, okay, that may or may not be a good argument for keeping the current system. The other thing that would be lost, I suspect, I raised the two arguments in my talk that are sometimes heard. The one about it's somehow unfair to kind of overlook the special needs of people in rural areas and that sort of thing. I don't think that flies. The practical issue about where you invest money, I think, is a practical issue that can be solved practically. But the serious argument for keeping the Electoral College is the one that goes back to our roots, because it's the one that reminds us that the name of our country is the United States of America. And the states do retain a certain amount of sovereignty. In fact, a large amount of sovereignty in many areas, in legal areas, in granting driver's licenses, in funding libraries, to pick an example close to home. And so if we're going to be paying more than lip service to the idea that we are a union of states, we are not the United People of America, we're the United States of America, then there is some, at least historical logic behind the idea that the states should be making decisions as units, as blocks. And that's what we have. And, there's an interesting little factoid about this, which I always tell my students who find it very interesting. We've all seen the Declaration of Independence in the original parchment, that was written in July of 1776. And as we all know, it says across the top, the Declaration of Independence of the 13 United States of America. Interesting thing about that is the word united is not capitalized. And what that means, at least what it means to me, is that they were not thinking that there would be a country called the USA, the United States of America. Rather, they were pointing out that this declaration was being issued by 13 states that happened to be united in their quest for independence from the British Crown. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, of course, the original structure, the original skeleton of the country, the Articles of Confederation, which were enacted shortly after the country became independent, didn't last very long. They were not viable for many reasons. The Constitution came into existence in 1787, ratified in 1791, and by that time, there was a single country. But because of that history of this country as being a group of states, it's not irrational to say that we should vote that way.
So if we can't realistically abandon the Electoral College, this is another question that came in. What can we do to get as close as possible to one person, one vote in our lifetime?
You got me there. I'm not sure there's much we can do, because if the Electoral College allocation of votes remains what it is, and again, it's in the Constitution, it can't be changed without an amendment, then the citizens of Wyoming and the citizens of Montana and the citizens of Vermont, incidentally, to cite a blue state, the citizens of Delaware, another blue state, will be overrepresented. And the citizens of California and Texas and Florida and New York and Illinois will be underrepresented. There's nothing we can do about that. Well, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that a little. There's one thing that could be done without a constitutional amendment, and that is the states themselves could decide to allocate their votes differently. That is, they could do what Maine and Nebraska have done. Maine and Nebraska have allocated their electoral votes so that the winner of the state gets 2 of their state's votes, and the winner of each individual congressional district gets 1. And that makes a lot of sense because it brings the representation down to the people where it counts or should count. And states can do that. There's no reason they can't. But no state that is currently strongly blue or strongly red is going to be inclined to do that because at the moment, let's say Texas. Let's take Texas, for example. Texas, the state government of Texas is pretty confident, and with pretty good reason, that Texas is going to be red. It's going to elect a Republican presidential candidate. It's going to elect a Republican governor. It's going to elect Republican senators. It's a Republican state. But there are big cities in Texas: Austin, Dallas, Houston, El Paso, San Antonio, big cities. Those big cities tend to be Democratic. So if Texas were to adopt that system, the Republican leadership would be giving away Democratic votes because Texas would no longer cast all of its votes for the Republican candidate. The congressional district that includes Austin, the congressional district that includes Dallas, the congressional district that includes Houston, all of those would be blue. They would be Democratic votes. So it could be done, but there would have to be political will.
Yeah, that speaks to another question that came in that was, although we have winner-take-all states, are there any situations where, electoral college votes can be split? So you sort of touched on that.
Yes. And there are, again, those 2 states. And given Nebraska, for example, Nebraska has two congressional districts, I believe. One of them is the city of Omaha, which is a big city for that part of the country anyway. And that big city, like most big cities, is Democratic. Kamala Harris anticipates that she will get the electoral vote from Omaha. She will certainly not get the electoral vote for the other congressional district that's all rural, and she will not get the 2 electoral votes that depend on the entire state. So, but that one electoral vote, given how close this is, could be really critical. In Maine, exactly the opposite is the case. There is a congressional district that has leaned Republican in Maine, and Donald Trump could perhaps pick up one of Maine's congressional district electoral votes, with Kamala Harris getting all of the others.
Right. We have another question that's come in, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. It's the first I'm hearing of it. The question is, can you speak to this secret, in quotes, that former President Trump alluded to during his speech at Madison Square Garden? This was revealed to be a contingent election possibility. I am not familiar with this. Have you heard anything about a contingent election possibility?
Well, I have, although it's very hard to credit it with any seriousness. There are various theories as to how this might play out. First of all, one question I expected to be asked but wasn't, or haven't been yet anyway, is what happens if there's a tie? And if there is a tie in the Electoral College, remember, it's an even number of seats in the Electoral College, and 538. So 269 to 269 is not an impossibility logically. It could happen. If it did happen, then the race would go to the House of Representatives to decide. However, the House of Representatives would not vote by majority. Each state would cast one single vote. There would be a total of a maximum of 50 votes. And that vote would go to the state that has the majority of that, the candidate who has the majority of that state's delegation. And if the state happens to be evenly split, then the state loses its vote. It abstains, in effect. Well, because of the urban-rural thing, again, there are more Republican states with, there are more red congressional delegations than there are blue ones. So if there were to be a tie, it's virtually assured that Donald Trump would be elected. The Senate, however, would choose the next vice president. And the Senate would vote, if it had to do that, if there were a tie, the Senate would vote one person, one vote. So it is conceivable. I mean, this is really the realm of fantasy, but it's conceivable that that the president of the United States inaugurated on January 20th would be Donald Trump, and the vice president inaugurated on January 20th would be Tim Walz. It's possible.
That is.
Now, this contingent election thing, I think, has to do with the idea that there would not be enough votes to decide because so many electoral votes would be challenged, that there would not be a majority. But I don't know that helps Trump very much. If somehow there were no outcome when Congress meets on January 5th to open, or January 6th, I'm sorry, to open the electoral ballots, nobody got a majority not because it was a tie, but because there were some votes that are contested and they're still in the courts or whatever. Joe Biden's term ends at 12 o'clock noon Eastern on January 20th, 2025, full stop. So who would be president while we're sorting this out? Well, Vice President Harris's term also ends. So the next person in the line of succession is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now you would say, oh, gee, well, that's Mike Johnson. It may not be Mike Johnson because there will be a new Congress in place.
Yes.
It would be whoever they elect, and they could conceivably be Democratic by then.
Let's talk. I have one question left, and this is really, you spoke on a little bit about January 6th, and I want to just bring this back up primarily to sort of set the record straight, and then we'll close. And so it is the question of certifying the state electoral college results. I think what has gone on over these last 4 years and everything from 2020, and you had mentioned it in your talk, and that is the role of the vice president, being largely ceremonial, and there to simply enact the decisions that the states have made. I just want to make sure that I heard that correctly, and if so, repeating it for our audience. You
did hear it correctly. So the way the Constitution formulates all this is that essentially the vice president's role is to hold a letter opener in her right hand and a series of 51 envelopes in her left hand, and in alphabetical order, slip the envelopes open, take out the piece of paper, and starting with Alabama, saying the state of Alabama casts its however many electoral votes for Donald Trump, and they always say the state. So Donald Trump of the state of Florida, they would say. She will say. And she will go through the alphabet. Now, it is open to members of Congress to challenge the electoral vote as not reflective of what actually happened in the state. But if there is certification from the state governor, and the state governor is supposed to sign those ballots, then my view, and I think most people's view, is that challenges are perfunctory. They're for show only. But what happens if there is a challenge in the state itself? Or if, as happened in 2020, there are two groups of people, both of whom claim to be the elected, the designated electors for the state. And let's assume that the governor has not signed either one because the governor isn't sure who the winner was because it's in court or because it was too close or they're doing another recount or heaven only knows what. That would allow the vice president to entertain a motion, I imagine, to exclude those votes. But it isn't as if that would allow the vice president to change the outcome. The idea that Mike Pence had the authority to change the outcome by simply refusing to accept electoral votes from states where the outcome was close was nonsense. Those were signed by governors and had to be accepted. No governor in a state that was close in 2020 refused to sign the electoral ballots. And there were some fraudulent ballots delivered to Washington claiming to have been issued on behalf of legitimately elected electors. One of them actually found its way into the Capitol building. But thankfully, Mike Pence understood, he went to law school after all, he understood that, unlike his boss, understood that that was not something that he had the power to do.
So, as we come to the bottom of the hour, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first thank you, Stephen. This, again, has been illuminating. You have provided us with so much information, clarification, told us what to watch for on election night, given us the historical sort of perspective and foundation for this process. And I think, like so many people, have allayed a lot of fears and hopefully helped sort of quell some of the anxiety that people are feeling leading up to election day. We are in election season. Early voting has begun. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and sharing that with all of us.
Well, it's my great pleasure, Scott. Thank you for inviting me. And just to be able to participate in something like this in the borough of Queens just brings me enormous joy. It really does.
Thank you. To everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning into this important conversation. It is election season. Early voting in New York City has begun. It opened this past Saturday on October 26th. It goes all the way through November 3rd, gearing up for Election Day on November 5th. Go vote. If you need any information regarding voting, please visit us online at queenslibrary.org. Thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful evening and good night.